Okay, so for 11-2, we're learning about radian measure. So first we have to know what a radian is. We use RAD for radians. 1 radian is the measure of a central angle where the arc length equals the radius. Now, if you recall from 11-1, arc length is when we take the measure of the arc over 360 times circumference. So when this equals the radius, that is 1 radian. So that's how that works. You may have heard radian before when we were back in chapter 10, and calculators are either in degrees or radians, which means radian is a different type of units than degrees, okay? So radian measure is expressed as theta. It's the Greek letter theta. It looks like kind of like a 0 with a slash through it, but not all the way through. But it's like an O with a line through it. We call that theta. So that's meaning an angle. That's theta. It describes a central angle measure. So in 11-1, a central angle measure was in degrees. Now we're talking about it in radians. So degrees, radians, okay? The way that we find radian measure, so we can find theta by doing the arc length, not the arc measure, arc length, remember those are two different things, over the radius. So we divide arc length by the radius and we get our radian measure. Now, the reverse of that, if I just move this formula around, if I want to find arc length, this formula is actually really easy. So arc length, I just do radius times radian measure. Now that's actually less work than doing measure of arc over 360 times circumference. If I have radius and radian measure, I just multiply those two, and then I don't have to do all of this work over here. Now, sometimes we'll be switching between radians and degrees. So to go from degrees to radians, we take our degrees, let's say 90 degrees, 90 degrees, and we multiply it by pi over 180. Now we know that any number can be over 1. So I do 90 times pi is 90 pi over 180. And then I can reduce that. 90 goes into both of those, so that equals pi over 2. So 90 degrees equals pi over 2 radians. And you have to write radians. You always have to write your units in the circles. Okay, so 90 degrees or pi over 2 radians. Now, what if we wanted to go from radians to degrees? Well, most of the time radians have pi. Sometimes they don't, but most of the time they do, okay? So for most of the time that they do, I would have, let's say, pi over 4 radians. Let's see what that is. And then I would multiply it by 180 over pi. Well, what happens here when I have pi times 180 and 4 times pi? I have a pi on top, pi on bottom. Those cancel out, and I am just left with 180 over 4. Well, 180 divided by 4 divided by 2 is 90, divided by 2 again is 45. So I'm left with 45 degrees. And that makes sense, and I put the degree symbol there. Now, occasionally we'll have, so that was pi over 4 radians. Occasionally we'll just have like 6 radians. It's not very common, but it is possible, okay? And so you still have to multiply by 180 over pi. So we multiply by 180, and then degrees almost never has pi. So we actually divide 6 times 180 divided by pi. I don't have a calculator nearby, but we'd actually put that in the calculator to get to degrees. Most of the time we don't put things in the calculator. This is the only situation where we do. So that's how we convert. Let's look at some textbook example problems. So as you can see, 1 radian is when the radius equals the arc length. But I want to talk about example problems. So if we were given, so right here, I'm trying to find the radian measure. So I just do arc length, and I know that's the length, not the measure, because it has units. Remember, measure is in degrees, and length is in units, inches, feet, miles, all those things. So I can say that this angle is pi over 3 radians, okay? Now, converting between radians and degrees, I already said, we multiply by 180 over pi, the pi's cancel out, we divide and reduce, and we get 135 degrees. Well, what if we have 27 degrees? Multiply by pi over 180, we reduce, and we get 3 pi over 20 radians. And last but not least, what if I wanted to find the arc length? Well, all I have to do is arc length equals radius times radian measure. My radius is 3 inches. My radian measure are these two. So I just have to do 3 times 5 pi over 6 to get what S is. And if I wanted to find B, I would just do 3 times 2 pi over 3. So nothing too crazy is happening here, and that one says to round. Most of the time we leave in terms of pi unless it says to round. So make sure you're reading a question carefully enough. So that's what we're dealing with 11-2 radian measure is all about.